Okay, so why do we spend so much time talking about osmosis, tonicity, and water and solutes and solvents? Well, one practical use of tonicity are intravenous fluids. And again, you might have seen this in the hospital. So, when they have that bag of water or solution and they're hanging up on that rack, and then they poke a needle into someone's vein and they drip that fluid into there. Well, why do they do that? Are they just doing it just for fun? No, they're actually trying to replace some sort of fluid or affect things with the fluids inside the body. So the cool thing about IV fluids is like they not only can add water to the body, but they can actually move water in and out of the body via osmosis. Now, what's one practical application of this? One is cerebral edema. Okay, so what are we looking at here? We're actually looking at what we call a CT scan. And in general, when you see something on a CT scan, the more white and bright it is, the denser the objects being imaged in the CT scan. So as you can see here, there's a very dense and bright white ring around this section right here. So what we're actually seeing is a cross section of the head. So we're actually seeing cross sections like going this way. So which plane is that? Is that frontal? Is that sagittal? Or is that transverse? So yeah, this is a transverse cross section. So what we have here is all the bone around here and what's contained inside your skull. Your brain, right? So you notice that the brain is less dense than the surrounding bone. That makes sense. But look at this region. So this is actually a very dense, remember, the whiter it is, the more dense the object. So this is actually a brain tumor, but that's not actually what we're looking at here with edema. Notice that this E, that's where we have that edema. So edema is the medical term for when fluid builds up in the tissue or part of the body. So we actually have fluid building up in the brain. And remember, compared to hard solid bone, a fluid like cerebral spinal fluid, and that's actually what you would find in these dark chambers right here, that's relatively less dense. So we're actually seeing a dark pocket. Why? Because fluid is accumulating in that area. Now compare that to this brain right here. So notice that this brain has a lot of this area right here. You don't actually see those dark pockets. In fact, this brain is so swollen. You can see these dark pockets are kind of like shrunk because the brain is starting to expand. Actually pushes and kind of closes up those chambers. And right here, you can also see that the darker area is more diffuse and wider compared to the darker areas in this brain right here. So what's happening is this brain is building up a lot of fluids. This is what we call intracranial pressure. So inside the skull, that has a lot of pressure due to fluids accumulating. So this is why we call it cerebral edema. The brains are pretty much getting waterlogged. So what do you also notice in this brain here on the right? Well, this is a normal brain over here, but look at the brain with edema. Notice that it's not only fatter and larger, but notice that it's more swollen. The folds, what we call sulci and gyri, or the folds and the creases, that's what we call sulci and gyri. Don't worry, we'll get to that when we get to exam 3. But notice that, yeah, it's a lot shallower because it's so waterlogged and swollen. So why is this such a concern? Is it just water in the brain? Well, the thing is that your brain has a lot of blood vessels. So if these blood vessels are on the surface of the brain, and you have all this fluid here, the blood vessels here, and this hard bone, these blood vessels get smashed by the pressure of the brain pushing against that hard bone. Because again, that bone, their skull, doesn't really flex compared to other parts of your body. So that brain is being put subject to a lot of pressure, therefore cutting off those blood vessels. And if those blood vessels experience a lot of pressure, that causes the starvation of oxygen, nutrients, and other things that the cells or your neurons and other cells in your brain need. So how can we reduce the swelling? So what do we have with edema? Too much fluid. So how do you draw fluid out of something? So this is where, how can we reduce the swelling? Well, we can use osmosis. So remember, in the body, when we're talking about osmosis and the major solvent in the body, that's water. So we can use osmosis to draw out fluids. When you have a membrane, which side does the water go to? The part with the higher concentration or the lower concentration? Remember, if you have two different fluids, it's going to, and you have a semi-permeable membrane that's permeable to water, it's going to go from the area of low solute concentration to the high solute concentration. So you want an IV that somehow takes the fluid from the brain and draws it out. So examples of the fluids that might be able to draw out water include mannitol and oral glycerols. So the objective of this is to draw out water from the brain, right? So what are you going to do? Do you want a higher solute concentration in the brain or a higher solute concentration in the fluids surrounding the brain? Maybe you want it in the extracellular fluids surrounding the brain. Why? Because if this has a high solute concentration and this has a very low solute concentration, it's actually going to draw water from the brain and the surrounding tissues into that extracellular fluid and blood. So this is why you typically want to use why hypertonic solutions are typically used in the treatment of cerebral edema. Again, if you have a high solute concentration, that draws out water via osmosis. So by having a hypertonic solution relative to the cells, that helps to draw out water.